Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Neil Sagoo, a partner at Maples Teesdale and head of our office sector team. The office market has seen sustained momentum over the last 6 months after the uncertainty of the pandemic. So we are privileged to have some of the key players of the market with us here this morning. They will be discussing the state of the market, the merits of development versus refurb versus retrofit, and sharing their top tips on improving sustainability. We will start with a keynote speaker, Lee Williamson from Spring 4. Lee is a director at Spring 4 and provides market-leading advice on leasehold acquisitions and lease restructures throughout the UK. Lee will be followed by Anna Klein, a partner and our head of ESG at Maples Teesdale. Anna is going to look at green lease provisions and what we are seeing in the market. And then my colleague Adam Bernstein will lead the panel discussion alongside James Goldsmith, head of leasing at AXA IM Real Assets, Matt Weaver, corporate investment manager at Fabrics, Juliet Morgan, ESG consultancy director in the climate action and sustainability practice at Gensler, Richard Pepperell, partner and founder at Spring 4, and finally David Kayser, head of real estate, UK, Ireland, Middle East and Africa at WeWork. So as you can see, we have a fantastic selection of speakers with an opportunity for Q&A at the end. With that, please can you welcome to the front Lee Williamson. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil, for your introduction. As Neil said, my name's Lee. I'm a director at Spring 4. Our business specialises in representing occupiers of real estate, tenants. And so with that in mind, we feel like we've got some quite interesting insights into how occupiers of real estate perceive ESG and property. So that's what I'll be talking about today for the next 10 minutes. So my first slide, accreditation minefield. There's a lot of accreditations out there. And for all intents and purposes, they're fantastic because they help you benchmark buildings. Landlords can really showcase certain aspects of their building from an ESG perspective and other angles. But one of the challenges at the moment is there's a lot out there, and that can be quite confusing to tenants. You know, most tenants aren't specializing, their core businesses aren't in commercial property. So out of all the accreditations that are out there, they might be familiar with EPC, possibly BREEAM, but that's usually where it ends. And what you see on the screen here is just a snapshot of some of the accreditations that are out there at the moment. You see 9. And I got those 9 accreditations from 2 websites, from 2 buildings that are currently being marketed in the City of London. So 9 accreditations, 2 buildings, and the only consistency between those buildings is BREEAM and EPC at the bottom. 7 accreditations are unique to each building. So from a tenant's perspective, it's almost impossible to compare apples to apples. You don't really know what you're looking at when you're looking at one building to another building from an ESG perspective. I'm not sure if there's a completely simple solution to that, but I think it definitely helps if landlords are able to be a bit more, I suppose, innovative in the way they communicate their ESG credentials, not just slapping on accreditations on marketing materials and websites, but having a bit more language around what they're trying to achieve and how their buildings are meeting certain ESG criteria. So on that note, what are tenants actually thinking about when it comes to ESG? So I think one of the conclusions Spring 4 has come up with is that actually every tenant is completely unique in how they see ESG. So as one extreme example, Richard, who's speaking on the panel later, and I were invited to respond to an RFP by a global bank last year. And as part of that RFP process, there are a huge number of ESG-related questions, both in terms of our knowledge of ESG, how we would use our knowledge of ESG with the requirements, etc. And despite that, and quite interestingly, we actually got a copy of their scorecard matrix after the RFP process was completed. You can see here they've got 25% allocated to what we would charge them, 25% to how we come across in the presentations, but there's nothing there explicitly about ESG despite all of the questions that we were asked. that actually followed through to the actual requirements, and they were out looking at options on the market. They had another matrix, 20% goes to location, 20% goes to floor plate, but again, there was nothing explicitly there for ESG. And this is a global bank. Their annual report from 2021 has 12 pages on ESG, but it never really was at the forefront of their minds during their requirements. So from an ESG perspective, I suppose that's quite disappointing. But on the flip side, we have other tenants that are very ESG minded. We've got a technology company that we're currently working with, and they won't view anything until we've done a lot of work behind the scenes in terms of unlocking ESG credentials for individual buildings. And they really want to align their goals and objectives from an ESG perspective to the building they eventually choose. So there's a huge spectrum out there. Something else that we're seeing from tenants is a strong desire to get deeper engagement with landlords and more personalization with how they accommodate ESG needs. But one thing I would say is that there are some absolute fundamental basics that need to be achieved before you can even get to having those conversations. So as another example, I have a client in Canary Wharf who had a lease expire 3.5 years ago. They've only just now been served a bill for £100,000 on a service charge reconciliation from a service charge year from whenever it was, 2019, 2018. We've got countless clients that can't get transparent PPM programs from their landlords. And if you can't get those things right, it's really hard to get some of the more interesting things right, like air conditioning turn down, smart sub-metering, and other things. For decades in the UK and London markets, landlords have usually marketed their office spaces in what we call a Category A condition. I think most of you probably know what that means, but if you don't, it's basically an empty office with a raised floor, typically a suspended ceiling, lights, and air conditioning. And from an ESG perspective, I don't think that's great. And the reason for that is when a tenant takes a Cat A space, they've obviously got to do their own fit out to the space. And when they do that, invariably, that creates wastage and double work. So as an extreme example, I've got a client at the moment who I'm acquiring 6,000 square feet for in St. James's. And because of the market there, landlords want to try and really achieve top rents. Rents are in excess of £100 per square foot. It's some of the highest rents in the world. So to attract the best tenants, they're really creating some amazing bespoke Category A finishes. So the building that we're acquiring has an amazing wood panel finish on the ceiling. It looks fantastic. But people are going to cringe at this. My client's going to have to remove and dispose of 95% of the ceiling to accommodate their fit out. So from an ESG perspective, that's disastrous. So what are the alternatives to Cat A? Well, you have all of the sort of Cat A plus, Cat B, fitted, managed, flexi offerings in the market, which are fantastic for certain tenants. But you could argue maybe there's a lack of personalization and maybe it doesn't work at a certain scale. So the alternative to that is shell and core, essentially taking an office in a shell. So from an ESG perspective, that's probably much better. You're not doing a lot of that double counting or creating wastage, but that does create, there are some issues. Some tenants don't like the taking on the construction risk of doing the Cat A, particularly if it's not their core business. Some landlords might prefer to market their space in Cat A just because it presents better and might be easier to let. And I suppose there's probably never been, I've had lots of conversations and negotiations with landlords over Cat A contributions, and it's pretty rare to finish a negotiation on Cat A contributions and have both the tenant and the landlord feel happy with the number that we land on. So there are challenges there. One of the best things a landlord can do is to not knock down a building and rebuild it. It's repurposing buildings. And last Friday, I was in Amsterdam with work and I had the pleasure of seeing this building, which is called Edge West. It was built in the late 1970s, and the current landlord wants to basically bring it up to modern standards. And I think this is an amazing example of a repurposed building done well. If you look at the right-hand side picture, what the landlord did was place a dome on top of what was an open-air space. It's basically activated the inside of the building and created a huge communal social area. They've placed solar panels around the dome, and the building actually creates more energy than it needs, so it actually puts energy back into the grid. All the tenants have a smart app that controls personalization on cooling, heating, lighting, and also social apps as well to allow the tenants in the building to sort of engage with each other and create more of a community feel. So that's an amazing example of a repurposed building done right. Doesn't always work perfectly. There can be buildings where, just because of the older construction methods, agents always like to use the term pinball machine for floor plates that have too many columns. And that is unfortunately something that some tenants are just turned off by, and that's the reality. From a legislative perspective, you're probably all aware of MEES, Minimum Energy Efficiency Standards. This was introduced in 2008, which meant that by 2018 you had to have a minimum grade E for any new lettings. There's current legislation in the pipeline to improve on that, to try and get to grade C by 2027 and grade B by 2030. It's not established yet or set in stone, but that looks to be what's happening. And that's taken a lot. Tenants are quite interested in that. So whenever I speak to tenants and they're taking a 10-year view, if you're looking to sign a 10-year lease, they're often asking, well, if the building's grade D or grade B, what does that mean for my occupation? When do works have to be carried out to improve the EPC rating? Who has to carry them out? Will it materially impact how I occupy the space? And who's paying for it? So there's lots of question marks over that, and that'll be quite interesting to see how that progresses. Then we get to green lease clauses. So what are we actually seeing going into leases? Well, I think Anna Klein will be able to tell you a lot more about it than me, but some of the things that Richard and I are seeing, there's lots of clauses around encouraging tenants to use sustainable materials for certain types of construction, and that will be placed into leases. I've got a client in Shoreditch at the moment whose landlord has just carried out an EPC report. They'd like the tenants to carry out all of the EPC upgrade recommendations as part of that report. The tenant's very on board for doing that because of their own ESG agenda. So the landlord's giving them a big pot of money to do that, and that's all going to be baked into the lease documents. But on that note, I think it's probably suitable to hand over to Anna. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Lee. So, good morning, I'm Anna Klein. I'm a real estate partner and head of ESG at Maples Teesdale. As we've mentioned, as a firm, we're currently advising businesses across all stages of sustainable development, from planning and construction to letting and financing. And our goal is to ensure that our clients' legal documents reflect their sustainability goals and their appetites. As a real estate lawyer, my particular area of expertise is green leases, so that's what I'll be discussing with you briefly today. So we chose the title of today's event, 50 Shades of Green, to reflect our experience that each business has its own targets and levels of comfort around ESG, with approaches that vary from very cautious to institutionally acceptable to extremely innovative and everything in between. Whatever the level of appetite, it's rare to find any responsible businesses that don't have ESG on their agenda and aren't already updating their green lease clauses or looking to do so in the near future. We've already reviewed a number of our clients' precedent leases and suggested updates to them, both to make sure that they're covering currently acceptable legal green lease clauses, and also to future-proof their documents as much as possible to reflect the further inevitable changes to come. This is a fast-moving and evolving area of law and legal drafting, and it's definitely not a case of one shade suits all. In considering green lease clauses, we need to consider both a business's approach to ESG and also the nature of each of their assets, because in general, one shade doesn't suit all buildings and businesses. So what is the link between ESG and green leases? The focus on green leases is very much on E at the moment. We're starting to see some of the S elements coming in. We are seeing ESG considerations becoming increasingly important, and we don't see that changing anytime soon because it's inevitable there's going to be increased regulation. There's the changes to MEES, which Lee's already touched upon, which are very much prominent in everyone's minds. And 2050's net zero emissions target is fast approaching. So we are seeing generally people are accepting general statements about parties' intentions to cooperate and promote environmental performance. We're seeing people are comfortable now or more comfortable with data sharing, establishing environmental forums in their buildings, metering, and provisions about obtaining EPCs. We're also seeing the requirement that alterations and works, whether often just with the tenant, but now increasingly for tenants and landlords, being seen to be not negatively affecting EPC ratings. And also, we're seeing landlords having increased rights of access to carry out works to improve sustainable performance of their premises and building. What we're seeing in terms of darker shades of green, we're looking at the use of green energy. So this is asking tenants or landlords to ensure that any electricity that they use is REGO certified and that any gas is from a renewable source also. We're also having clauses saying that this requirement to use green energy should apply whether or not it impacts on the cost of the energy provided. We're also having landlords looking at extended, more specific rights to install meters to ensure that they can monitor their environmental performance. We're seeing clauses like cleaning provisions, asking tenants to use certain products, and landlords also, and also to carry out cleaning at certain times in certain ways to ensure that buildings aren't being unused and then reused for cleaning people. They should all be in when we're actually occupying and using the space ourselves. We're also looking at green transport provisions in some leases where landlords are required to collect green transport information from their occupiers and to report back and share data on that to the occupiers. We're also seeing, as Lee briefly mentioned as well, the need to fit out sustainably, whether that's in terms of the materials used or the furniture installed, whether that could be recycled, and also electrical equipment of certain energy efficiency standards. We're also seeing redecoration. Instead of requiring redecoration on specific dates, which has been the industry standard, we're now saying that redecoration should only be carried out when reasonably necessary. And so that should hopefully avoid the unnecessary use of redecoration materials just to comply with lease clauses. We are also seeing certifications. This is a newer one and much more specific to a newly refitted or newly developed site. We've got landlords who have BREEAM excellent buildings or EPC-As, and we want to ensure that tenants don't do anything to affect that. So we're seeing provisions in that, leases around that. And we're also seeing landlords who want to achieve certain standards of performance, and they're asking tenants to get on board to help them achieve that as well. But again, that's much more specific to that type of property. We're also seeing requirements around coordinated deliveries, so not all deliveries coming at different times. This relies on a certain amount of infrastructure in place, but again, it's going to be increasingly apparent that this is going to be required, and this is kind of creeping into planning as well. And then reinstatement, this is quite an interesting one that I think will become much more acceptable much quicker. There's specific statements stating a tenant will not be required to reinstate if that will adversely affect the energy performance of the premises, unless reinstatement is reasonably required by the landlord because it has plans in terms of reuse or reletting. So that's something that I think will be growing for all of us. As legal advisors, what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing that many of our clients have green leases in their clauses. Some have strict policies around removal or significant amendment, saying that anything of that nature needs to have board or director level approval. Increasingly, clients are collecting and using green data, and we're seeing a lot less pushback on green lease clauses from tenants, even in lease renewals where the position isn't too clear. We are also seeing heads of terms referring to green lease clauses either specifically or generically, with the intention being to try and reduce negotiation time around these points. That said, appetites for green leases do still vary across the board, and we have some clients who are very comfortable with the light green type of provisions and others who are much more keen on the more innovative dark green. So, as I mentioned at the outset, this is an evolving area and there are no industry norms as yet, and there are no standard approaches. But particularly the areas of concern that we are often discussing are costs and who's going to bear the costs of these kind of provisions. We're seeing that that's very much a negotiation point. And to touch on what Lee was saying earlier, landlords offering incentives, financial incentives to tenants, I think we'll see increasingly. And we are also obviously finding that tenants are more likely to push back on green lease clauses if they have a shorter term lease, because they don't see the benefit to them for taking on responsibilities when they're not going to be at the premises for a very long time. And then the other issue that's a huge area of discussion is enforcement. It's very, very unlikely that a landlord would forfeit a lease because the green lease provisions aren't being complied with. So what do you do? Is it a carrot or a stick approach? We're not really there yet. We are seeing things like green bonds that can be drawn down from if a tenant doesn't comply with their obligations. And we are saying things like capital contributions to certain works. So this has been a quick race through the key trends that we're seeing in green leases, and I hope it's been useful. I'll be around afterwards if anyone has any specific questions they'd like to ask. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Adam to start the panel discussion.
Great. Thank you, Anna. So before we get started, just wanted to give you an outline of how this is going to work. We're going to have a general discussion amongst all of the panellists about the hot areas in the office market, the key considerations for the future of the office, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions after that. So if we can get started thinking about one of the hottest topics, it's the refurb versus new build debate. So I was wondering whether our panellists could tell us what they think are the main considerations that landlords and developers should be taking into account when designing a new office building. So James, if I can start with you, and perhaps if you can think about 22 Bishopsgate, and then also what you might do differently if you were designing a new building again.
Yeah, that's a really big question, isn't it? I guess for everyone here, that decision of whether to redevelop used to be quite an easy one. You'd look at a cash flow and a spreadsheet. You'd think, well, that's what it's going to cost. That's what it's worth. These are the risks, and this is how much profit I need. And perhaps the biggest imponderable in all of that was risk, and therefore what that drove everyone to do was to build in a very safe fashion. We built buildings for developers and investors. And I think that's where the mood change is changing. And I think there's two great examples here of probably a little bit on the less institutional side of things. The mood has changed, and if you are putting up a building, you're putting it up for a very long time. I think it was Renzo Piano who said that if you're an author and you write a duff book, then it'll sit on the shelves and it'll get pulped. If you build a building, you're imposing ugliness on everyone for 100 years. And so it just therefore made, we're playing with big stakes, and therefore we were sort of quite cautious in our approach. But I think that is changing now, because value, and I really, like what Lee was saying, I think value now is less about the lease. A lease creates value at a point in time, but from there on, you have a diminishing asset. And actually what we should be saying is, hang on, the value is in the building. Value is about how buildings can adapt to different types of occupiers, different fashions, different needs over the long term. And the other thing we have to rely upon is not managing our relationships through leases, but managing our relationships through trust. It's a very different relationship, but you go to a banker and say, oh, by the way, we get on with these people really well. They're going to be paying their rent for a long time. That's a tough one, and that's why I mean about the deinstitutionalization, relying on the relationships we have, relying on the building to continue to adapt. So, that's a change that's happening pretty quickly, Adam.
And thanks, James. Just moving on to you, Juliet. Obviously coming at it from a design point of view. What would you say?
That you can save about 40% of carbon, whole life carbon, when you refurbish a building as opposed to building a new building. And what we're seeing in the market is a flight to quality. Occupiers wanting these buildings with their 9 different certifications. I've got 14 different certifications in my life. And that's being used as a proxy for ESG. And I think it's really important that we separate what ESG means versus what certification means, because they're being used interchangeably and they're not the same thing. So what we haven't seen is the occupier market prefer refurbished buildings. And if they were thinking about whole life carbon, then they would, because of that 40% saving. But invariably what we've seen is occupiers committing to net zero by 2030 in operations. So that goes to Caroline's rego-backed PPAs, clean energy, and there's an awful lot of song and dance actually out in the marketplace at the moment about companies very proud of themselves for taking, BREEAM outstanding buildings from a GRESB 5-star rated landlord, because they've done really well in net zero in operations. But actually, if you look at the weight of that building, the whole life cycle carbon, it can be a really heavy building. So my plea is that if anybody walks away from here, have a look at whole life cycle carbon as opposed to net zero in operations, because they are not the same thing. But yeah, if you want to save carbon, a refurbished building is the first place to start.
Marks and Spencer have something to say about that, mightn't they?
Yeah, I'm talking to a tower building at the moment, and it's a 40, 50-year-old tower. That carbon's been spent, and I think so much of what we aspire to is the aesthetic and the reassurance of a glass shiny building. But the reality is we've just spent that carbon again when there are perfectly good refurbished buildings that have been up for 60 years.
Okay, and then just moving on to a different perspective, David, the serviced office perspective. What are you looking for?
So I think I think for any occupier, but for an operator of real estate, for sure, a new building, a clean grid, good ceiling heights, ironically ticking all the ESG credentials, which maybe are a little bit misleading, that's much easier to operate, it's much easier to design, fit out, sell. But I do think that there's a lot to be said for repurposed buildings, bringing a lot. I think you have to look at a repurposed building and take what the difficult characteristics and bring out the beauty and try and operationalize and also monetize them. And I think we see our members, our tenants, our customers, we get incredible feedback where we've got a particularly difficult part of a building, it's listed, it's a basement, it's dark, it's challenging. And so we have to be more creative with that space, and you create something more special. And I think it is a change of mentality for maybe owners, developers, to think this isn't a problem area, this is an opportunity area. And architects love that sort of space, and so it's finding those solutions. So for sure, I think we in the UK we have 60,000 members, so we get a lot of feedback on what members look for, and there is no doubt that ESG, particularly the E, is becoming more and more important. But I agree that the understanding of the embodied carbon piece is sort of not understood. So I think we, as an operator, have to do a better job at that, as all landlords and agents and every stakeholder in real estate needs to do.
Okay, great. And Matt, just coming to you, I know that Fabric's USP is retrofit. So when you're in the design stage, what are your considerations?
Well, primarily we are a reuse developer at Fabrics, as you say. We go back to what Juliet said about whole life carbon. When we've got a building that we've purchased, our designs are weighing up the whole life carbon of, do we knock this down or can we reuse it? And there's two sides of the coin, because if you knock something down that might have been inefficient, you can build a really flash new tower with great operational performance, but you flushed away all the embodied carbon that already exists, and as Juliet said, you're putting new emissions out in the build. But equivalently, if you do reuse, you kind of have to be honest about how energy efficient you can make that building within your budget, especially at a time of rising costs. And even if you've saved the embodied carbon up front, the operational performance is going to catch up to you sooner or later, and you just really need to weigh up the whole life carbon of both those sides and how long it's going to last. Where you are reusing, I think what we're going to find is, as more and more assets become stranded, is that the way people reuse is going to become more inventive. And it's not necessarily a new idea. Loads of buildings in London have been old warehouses and now flats, fine, but I think it's just going to become more extreme. We've got one of our buildings is, in the 19th century, was like a ginger beer bottling plant. It had its own well through the 2 World Wars. It was an industrial warehouse, did a stint as a place of worship for a long time, and now we've turned it into a kind of modern studio workspace. And I think what David was saying, you were touching on before, is that these buildings have such great character, and actually occupiers love that. So we've saved a building and delivered something that people really, really enjoy. If you are redeveloping on the other side of it, perhaps we need to be a bit more innovative about how we do that. And one of the things we've been looking at is, how do we design buildings with materials that we already have, rather than fabricating new materials for the flash new design that we want, which is something probably architects don't actually like doing that much. One of the things we've been doing is the reuse of structural steel, which is actually a huge component of embodied carbon in a building. Whenever a building is getting pulled down, most of that steel is just going to be recycled, which is a great word, but actually what that means is they're melting it down and reforging it. So if you can actually design a new building from the kind of ashes of the old one without having to resmelt it, you can save up to 8% of embodied carbon on just your steel. And so building smart when you're redeveloping, I think, is the key point. And finally, I'd say, we talk about trying to be climate neutral with how we build. We also kind of have to think about climate resilience. No matter, you know, the efforts of everyone in this room and the world, climate is going to change, and the way our buildings are going to feel is going to be different. You know, you see it in cities when you cover something in concrete. We now have flash floods, and actually we're going to have to build different. You know, how can we, you know, in cities, how do we reintroduce nature to help protect us against flash flood, and how do we add shading to building so that cooling is easier? And I think that's something we're going to have to consider as well.
That's really interesting. So would that be roof terraces or gardens at the top?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's something we think about a lot in our schemes. How do we reintroduce nature? I mean, you see it in all parts of the world. Historical architecture in, you know, somewhere like East Asia, a lot of the thing is built out of stone, and there's lots of shading, lots of courtyards, which makes the building cool even in, you know, 40, 50 degree heat. And now we're building huge glass towers that have to have aircon in because they're so inappropriate for the climate that they're in. And I think that's going to have to change.
Okay, great. And then just moving on to the occupier point of view, Richard. Obviously, along with sustainability, what else are occupiers looking for, be it amenities in the building, outside the building, the local area? What are you seeing in the market at the moment? What are occupiers asking you for?
Well, Adam, I think the first thing that everybody should understand is that occupiers don't start with what we've just heard for the last 10 minutes. And that might be a central issue for the future. And I wish I'd sat in most of my meetings with that being at the front end of it, but it hasn't been. What they want to hear about is amenity-rich buildings. They're the consumer and occupier of the building and the local environment, and they want that for their staff, for their people, for their well-being. And that is the focus. There's a complete gravitation to the new, the best. It achieves all the accreditations. It wins the eyes, the hearts and minds of the tenant decision. And it's very difficult to get back to the refurbished, the old. Do you remember when it was? The pillars. And I think that is a change that will come with time, but you can understand from the business's perspective and the occupiers the decision to go to new, and you've seen that in the marketplace. At which point affordability isn't actually part of their problem because space has become tighter, they've used less. But the way in which the larger landlords of bigger buildings have provided that amenity within the building is very attractive, even more so with the struggling nature of the high street at the moment. And so I think the smaller buildings are going to be able to do it at sort of half the pace, half the rate. I think from a tenant's perspective, whether they're looking to acquire Cat A, Shell and Core, Cat B, Turnkey, ultimately they want the choice. And that choice comes to them in different forms. But don't forget that viewing Cat A space is an easier sell than viewing Shell and Core. The occupier doesn't have the vision to say this is what it can be. And I've stood in many Shell and Core trying to tell them that's what it's going to look like, and it's better, and it's not, just doesn't sink, doesn't happen. And I think just, you know, in terms of the embedded carbon, you know, they're also struggling to understand the reality of their own fit out, their own embedded carbon. They've written it down over 10 years. They say, oh, I can move and I've got no write-off to crystallise, but they're not actually putting a carbon credit on that they're looking at it and enjoying it, which I think is an interesting aspect of the accounting treatment and the way in which actually you should start to view what they're currently occupying. And I think sort of lastly, what I'm really seeing is that the tenants and the occupiers are looking at who's managing this building. And that is really very central. I think going to James's point, the closeness by which the tenant and the landlord and the managing agent have an operational relationship is key, and they really do want that. And I think that then leads on to what is that going to provide outside this rich amenity, this access, this flexibility, this environment that ensures people can turn up to my office and be productive. I think it goes beyond that, and there will be the start of data that's coming out, rich property using data that landlords will start to use and share with tenants. And I think that's going to be the next interesting thing. You know, the last 2 years, everybody used a desk booking app. If you hadn't, then that's now up there. That's just the start of where that starts to go, I think, in the way in which occupiers and tenants use their buildings.
Okay, and just picking up on the technology, David, I know from our conversations in the past, you've mentioned how hot WeWork are on using technology, and people might have seen that WeWork have signed a partnership with Yardi. So I was just wondering if you can give us a bit of a background on technology in WeWork spaces and also the Yardi partnership.
Yeah, sure. I think picking up on that last point, with occupiers and operators or landlords, owners working closely together, we quite often see occupiers coming in and ESG is low on the agenda, but then actually they're in and they're saying they've got to do a board report, they need to report on their carbon, and they come to us, and we track, to go into the technology point, we track the operations of our buildings so closely, one, to make sure that they're run very cost effectively, because we want to make some money at some point, two, so that our carbon footprint is very good, and three, because we feel that what technology does, if we, as a business, we work, we acquire, we design, we build, we operate, we sell, all in-house. If we're collecting data at every point of that, iterating our product constantly, that product is constantly improving. So I think it's really important that buildings are designed and fitted out with technology, because occupiers more and more want to understand how their buildings operate. And if you're not designing for that at day one, it's just more expensive to go and retrofit. I think the partnership we have with Yardi, I'm sure lots of people know Yardi, hopefully lots of people know WeWork. We have lots of technology that we've developed over the past 12 years in-house to aid our design and operation. Of course, Yardi have lots of technology too. So what we found in a post sort of COVID world is that lots of businesses have long-term liabilities, own buildings on long leases, or they want to stay in their HQ space. WeWork is not the right solution for them, but they see the benefit of our ability to track usage of their building and to use that data to encourage people to come into the office, to have a more enjoyable office experience, etc. So the partnership with Yardi is to pool our knowledge of technology, our programs, our IP, and sell a solution or give a solution to tenants who maybe want to stay in their buildings and not necessarily come into a WeWork, to better operationalise, improve the working experience and understand what's going on in their offices. I think it shocked when, I think it's interesting when we were in COVID and everyone was talking about footfall, 50%, 30% footfall. Well, pre-COVID, that was the footfall in offices. It's not changed that much. In WeWork, the footfall was much higher, but I think just there was a lack of awareness of it. So I think big occupiers and owners and owners have got a lot more savvy to that. So that's what the partnership is. It's bringing an opportunity to occupiers of non-WeWork space to benefit from understanding how their space is used and could be better used.
And yeah, interestingly, I know you touched on sort of making the employee or occupier experience better, and I suppose that kind of feeds into this whole concept of the people first office space. But I'm just wondering, Matt, what that kind of looks like from a design and development point of view.
Yeah, well, I think it's very easy to think about the people in the building, but sometimes we should also have to think about the people outside. For everyone who doesn't work in our industry, you go past an amazing new building, it kind of just looms over you. You don't actually get to see inside it. It's just like this award-winning monolith that means nothing to you personally. And I think what we tried to do is really address that. And when we're designing a building, we try to look at what needs are underserved in an area, be it like swimming pools or lack of access to nature and things like that. And one of our projects, Reaching the Sky, one of the things we identified was that there was a real lack of community meeting space. That used to be maybe in the town hall, the church hall, but the area that's kind of disappeared. So that underserved need informed our design decision, and we decided to put 13,000 square foot community garden and terrace on the part of the building that overlooks the Shard, which is arguably the most valuable area, to try and meet that need. But when we did that, and when we told the project team in 2020, early 2020, that's what we wanted to do, we had a lot of pushback, especially from agents who said, no tenant is going to want that in the building. No one's going to want to be near that. Don't do it.
Could you say that, Richard?
Well, you were probably talking to letting agents, not acquiring agents,
Yep.
and this is the difference.
I'm just wondering whether
you've got to talk to acquiring agents.
That is an issue.
Yeah,
It really is.
but that was January 2020. Okay, so and we persevered with that. Now, people love it. So like tenants that we speak to, prospective tenants, are coming in and saying everything this offers is ticking off every box on our employee survey. You know, every employee will say they want to do more to give back. And actually, if you have something like that in a building, it should be seen as a tenant amenity. You know, if a business is a corporate social responsibility strategy, they can go to that area, work with the local community, you know, and deploy that strategy on an ultra-local level without ever having to leave the building. And I think that's something that is going to start to change. The other thing I'll touch on is we can have like people-first buildings, but what about nature first? And you know, this goes back to what we were discussing before, is that we've kind of, cities are now so grey, you know, London's actually exceptionally green for a city, because we've put people first at every stage and we've not put nature first. And I think it goes beyond just having like a moss patch next to your plant on the roof, which people call green roofs. It's just not. You know, in Berlin, we've got a project there. It's like a big film site, and one of the problems there is that there was like historic industrial use. So the concrete has like destroyed the soil, and you basically can't grow anything, or like very limited. So what we're trying to do there is select plant species that we can plant that are not only hardy to survive in that sort of environment, but will actually restore the soil over time. And so one of the key considerations is, you know, yes, we've got to address people, but not just the people in the building, but also whilst doing so, how do we kind of bring greenery and nature back in?
And Juliet, I saw you nodding frantically there. So just thinking about Gensler and operating in a number of countries across Europe, are there any sort of features of design in Europe that we haven't yet seen in the UK market that may end up here, or vice versa, maybe if the UK are the leading country?
I think it's a bit of a mix. There are certainly policies in Europe, projects in Copenhagen where, not with us, but a developer has been reclaiming materials and managed to get a planning consent from the local authority when they couldn't actually tell them what the building was going to look like because they didn't know what the materials were going to be. And so that's an amazing example of like public-private partnership committing to retaining. You know, Paris has set targets around the timber use in buildings. We're still struggling with whether timber's going to burn down on towers that never had any timber in them. So there are opportunities where London can catch up. I also think things like the biodiversity net gain, that Letty said 10% biodiversity net gain on projects. In London, that's 2 more pigeons and an extra fox. So I think we can be more progressive about how we approach biophilic design, biodiverse design. And then we're starting to see more focus on the S. So we've got technology clients who are looking at how to share spaces with local communities, but also around mitigation and adaptation. So certainly in New York, we're starting to see companies looking at if there's a climate event, how does the building unlock and enable the local community to come and use it, whether it's very hot or very wet or hurricane or whatever it might be. So I think it's really important that we keep in mind adaptation and resilience as part of this conversation. We're all driving down ESG to a net zero, but we're seeing clients of ours wanting to be regenerative and wanting to be net positive, Microsoft being a good example, having gone very public about that. And so, yeah, there's pockets of things going on all over the world. London is definitely setting a very forward agenda with quite stringent targets by 2030, but we're not there yet. We're not. There are things certainly around the use of timber at scale needs to be addressed in this country, and that focus on social inclusion. I think what we're going to see is a huge wave of climate migrants, way faster than anybody is predicting at the moment. I don't know if any of you know, we're scheduled to go over 1.5 degrees by 2026. So that's 3.5 years away. I know you're all good at maths, but it kind of feels quite striking when we realise that tipping point is likely to trigger well over 10 million migrants crossing Europe at the moment just because of war, let alone climate problems. And I think that those policies around social inclusion are going to have to get much stronger.
And then just going back to the people first concept, James, what does that mean to you in a design and development point of view?
Just what Juliet said about 2026, so that's the next World Cup, which presumably won't be played in an air-conditioned stadium in the Middle East.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, it's difficult. So there's so many strands going on here. And actually, in many ways, what's really disappointing is hearing what Richard's saying about occupiers. And by the way, Richard's just saying as it is, because that is what we're experiencing as well. That people are talking a great game, but when it actually comes to it, we've had 2 or 3 people that have come into 22, and they've really put us through it on the sustainability credit. And actually, Matt, we've done very well for all sorts of reasons. Plus the fact it's going to be up there for 100 years. You know, people travelling, dense agglomeration, and all. When you put all these measures in, it does actually come out pretty well. And perhaps one of the big challenges, and just thinking what Juliet was saying about embedded carbon, is if you look at the planning process, it's only fairly recently that they're starting to making this a real issue when you put your planning consent in and saying, well, hang on, there's how much embedded carbon are you getting rid of, and how much are you going to be using? You know, we're very good at calculating, understand the financial metrics of the building in use, but not what has gone before. And that is changing. I think just looking at peers, I think the new London plan coming out now is actually making that a much higher agenda item. The city have just put out a document as well, and that's going to be a much bigger thing. You know, and we've seen Marks and Spencer and the kicking they've had. And you know, one of the reasons that Tulip was turned down by the inspector was they were worried about, well, that's great, but if it's not this, how do you adapt, and where's its reuse, and what are you losing by embedded carbon? Look, sorry, you asked about people. Look, it's always about people, and you know, the very simple proposition on 22 was about people. And the way I sort of just try and tell that story, Adam, is there's a really good book by Matthew Syed, who used to be a very good tennis player, but he now writes for the Times. He's a management consultant, and it was, I think it was Rebel Thinking and the Power of Diversity, and he came up with this really interesting example how in the 1970s and 1980s, the big tech companies in America were on Route 28, which goes north out of Boston, out of Cambridge. And these big tech companies, you used to have to drive there because they were all out of town. The gates would open because of security. And they created these massive silos. They were paranoid about maintaining IP. It was all about process. And at exactly the same time, out on the West Coast, there were kids in jeans and T-shirts hanging out in cafes and garages, and competitors sharing their ideas, people just exchanging ideas. And today, we all know what's happened in that place on the West Coast in Palo Alto, and none of those companies exist on Route 28. It's about people. It's about, you know, people working in that sort of environment. Right now, we're looking at this huge labour shortage. You know, people are the difference, because work isn't about process, it's about creating IP. So creating that environment to get good people where they can be, you know, fertile and work together is critical to any environment you make. And that's not just about the space, Matt, and I know you're very passionate about that. It's actually very much about how you manage and activate the space. And that's a skill set which our industry doesn't really have. You know, we're great at lots of things, and great at all sorts of things that need a spreadsheet to prove it. But, you know, the more sort of touchy-feely things, perhaps that's not quite there. And actually, the analogy I always use, Adam, because I know every developer likes to talk about their building being a hotel. You know, I don't go to work for the benefits you can get from a hotel. I mean, they're sort of service standards. You know, the environment that we always like to use, or the metaphor we like to use, is a university, because that's where people create their social networks. That's where they can take risks. That's where they're encouraged to do so.
Can I push back slightly?
Yeah. John?
I think we've optimised for people for a really long time, and we've all enjoyed the benefit of that. But if we don't start optimising for planet first and making very different decisions, so this is going to be all about balance. And I think there's certain policies, and particularly around, you know, wellness. I'm thinking about basements that drive 20% of carbon in a building that are being optimised for cycle storage. And I don't know how many vegan cyclists have to cycle 10 miles across London to go into a basement to justify the amount of embodied carbon that goes in the basement for lockers and showers that are empty 23 hours of the day.
Assuming they're not already there.
Assuming they're not already there for the 3 days a week that they're coming in. And then there's the terraces that we put out so that people have got access to wellness and fresh air for the 8 days a year it's not raining too cold or too hot. And I think if we looked through the lens of would the planet vote for this versus would people like it, we would start to question the design decisions, the proposition decisions. And so whilst I understand and appreciate buildings are for people, we're going to need the extra client, which is the planet, and ask whether she'd vote for the same thing.
No, listen, it's a really good point, and I like what Matt was saying about roof terraces and everything else, because, you know, and we talk about designing buildings and say, we need a roof terrace, tick, we need this, tick. How many car bike spaces? And there's this arms race to get more and more of the amenities. Do we really need them? We had quite a big battle with powers to be to actually reduce the amount of bike spaces in the building. you know, for exactly the reason that Juliet's making. So we've still got the biggest bike park in London, I think. But it would have been a lot bigger.
So will you share it? Because I'm really intrigued. Every single building having to put in their ratio of bike spaces. And I think there's a proper question for London here.
It goes back to exactly, I love what Lee was saying about, you know, the certifications. It's tick, we've got this, we've got this, we've got this, job done. You know, we just need to be a little bit more instinctive and sensible.
And David, just coming to you back to the people first design and development, do you agree with James, or do you look at different things?
I think the whole point of WeWork initially, if you've seen the TV series, was to put the occupier, like human beings, at the centre of office space. Like I think, like James was saying, people were just building big blocks of office for the business and not thinking about the people. So that's always been our thought process as a business. What does people want to work in? And I actually think developers, again, I know it's done a much better job at changing the emphasis to the person. I think with 22 Bishopsgate being a very good example. So I think like everyone is different, so people are productive in different ways. And if you walk the whole, like when we design WeWorks, we try and give as much flexibility in terms of how people can work. You know, some people will bizarrely lie on a couch and type away at their laptop and look like they're asleep, but actually, you know, that's how they're productive. I'm very boring, have to sit here, you know, typing away. Some people have lots of meetings. Some people don't want to speak to anybody. Some people come to the office for events or brainstorming days. So I think people, and now also businesses, see the purpose of the office as very, very different things. There's no one size fits all. So I think when we design and operate space now, we look at how we give flexibility, not only in time, but also in space, and provide lots of different opportunities for people to work in very different ways. I think that's really challenging for a developer to think about, because back to that operational point, like it's very easy, it's very easy to imagine and design and build something, but then to actually take it and operate it to keep that productive. So, you know, you can build an auditorium and a cafe and a restaurant and brainstorming rooms, but who's actually there making sure that it works for the occupier? And that's a really challenging thing. You know, I think that's something the occupiers need to look at more. What happens once I sign my lease with this building?
And I'm sure there'll be questions about that people first. But yeah, just conscious of time, so I just wanted to move on to the last question, which just a quick answer from James, Juliet, and Matt. Their top tips for increasing sustainability in offices. Maybe start with James.
I just think it's incumbent upon every one of us in the industry to educate ourselves about it. I was listening, I was on a panel last week, and someone who was the head of sustainability within quite a big property organisation was just talking about her frustrations with trying to get her colleagues on the agenda.
I keep talking about better, BETTI, better real estate decisions. And what I mean is your client doesn't have to take the wood out of the ceiling just because they don't like it. They can choose not to. And I think around materiality, biomaterials, we're about to put an exhibition of biomaterials in. Anybody can come and see it over the next couple of months. Use biodegradable materials that are in partnership with nature, because we add 40% of carbon onto buildings through fit out over the life cycle of the building. James built a really nice building to put it up. Other people will add 50% on fitting it out and stripping it out. So anything that's nature friendly, circular, biomaterials is the way forward.
Yeah, I think I'd say I'd just give caution at pursuing sustainability at the cost of well-being. I don't mean like yogurt and yoga. Like the point of sustainability is so that in 50 years, 100 years, we have a planet that's healthy, that we can have well-being in. The most energy efficient office building would be a box with no windows, where we just typed away at a computer, which no one wants. And I think we just have to consider that well-being is such an important part of sustainability. They should go hand in hand and be considered together.
Adam, could I just add one point, which I think is that the occupier's got a responsibility here, and that's to use it more. You know, you don't get onto it when you get onto a plane and it's half full. You feel good because you've got leg room, but then you feel bad because of the carbon burn. There are buildings that are half occupied, so they've got to use it more.
Okay, great. Going to hand over to Anna now for the Q&A, if that's.
Yeah. Yeah, just conscious of time. Maybe we just take one or maybe two questions from the audience. If anyone has any questions they wanted to ask the panel. At the back, yeah, James.
What do you think will be the biggest change to the traditional office space in the next 5 years?
Interesting. Anyone fancy taking that one?
It was interesting when we were chatting for this panel beforehand, we were all dialed in remotely. I think there's probably over 1,000 reasons anyone could pick from working from home versus coming to the office. Traditional offices, the way we used to do it, aren't fit for purpose. We've touched on it a little bit. The way it's going to, what an office is going to have to change, be it become a learning hub, a training hub, places where people can collaborate. And I think, the serviced office model, membership model probably has the place to fill there.
Need less of them. Going back to Richard's point.
I don't know if it'll be in 5 years. I hope not. But urban marinas, boat parks, because seawater has risen, and migrant reception centres for the same reason.
Does anyone else have a question? Yes.
James, Myth Chichester, St Congo. James, you alluded...
Changed since I saw you last.
Hi, James. You alluded...
You've just got a massive planning consent, haven't you?
Yeah, well, that's part of my question, driven by that element. With differing design codes in each particular local authorities up and down the country, this disparate nature of 14 or 12 or 11 governing authorities that manoeuvre there, you have to manoeuvre your way around. Where are we going with this? My point is that local authorities seem to drive the design codes. Local authorities seem to drive, they pick and choose which part of the design code, which part of the governance they require. And you as a developer or an investor or whatever at the other end of that, I'm busy trying to manoeuvre and navigate my way through this process, and each local authority is different, and it's confusing. My question is therefore, who is actually going to govern this thing and change one BRIAM, overarching element, or who's actually, is it at the federal central government level, or are the local authorities going to be able to just pick and choose when they want?
Blimey, is that a political question? I'm supposed to answer political questions.
It sounds a bit woolly, but it's actually based
No,
on real fact.
I completely get it and understand. For me, it has to be federal. It has to be central government. The environment has to create that consistency. But we've seen at the same.
All of all these 14, these 12 different elements that all have their different agenda and are making different amounts of money out of it. It's confusing.
Can I say something? I think what we've seen, like Copenhagen being a good example of what was cited, and developers we speak to, I think it's about the developer. If they put a really, I say good story, but more than that, like they actually put that thought at the heart of a new scheme and tell their message and build around that, like you were talking about with the terraces being accessible by public people. And so, I think that when you speak to city and our planners, that really compels them to look beyond all the certificates and like what actually is the message to the scheme. And I think branding in real estate has become so much more important, and using that to tell a story.
When you've got 14 different local authorities, or when you're different, actually Marks and Spencer Oxford Street is a really good example, because the decision the reason they got planning consent to redevelop that was for the economic revitalisation of Oxford Street, which all the councillors would say is a really good thing. But then you go headlong into a different agenda.
Just really quickly, I would say that a lot of cities have got net zero targets by 2025, 2030, 2040. And so to the extent, I think the uniform guiding thing from central government and at that city level will be your proof of principles around net zero and social value reporting.
Yeah, I see that.
Okay. Oh, one very quick last question, then we'll wrap up. Thanks.
Yes, in terms, the UK is the developed world. What about the developing world? How are you going to get this message across to the developing nations?
A global ESG role, and was talking to our team in China last week, and they were talking about dropping 25-year-old office buildings. And we know perfectly well there are 25-year-old office buildings being dropped just around here, so it's not common only to China. And what they said was, we don't have the luxury of GGBS concrete, recycled steel, and we're designing for human health because of post-COVID. And so what are the design principles that we can use that will still design out some of that carbon? And it was things like, get rid of the basement if you're going to have terraces, cut into the building. So there are things, and I also, there's a lot of conversation about how developing countries won't adapt as well. The counter argument is that they're so used to working in community and working with biomaterials that actually the assets and the people that are at risk are the developed world and less so the developing world.
Thank you. Right, okay, hand over to Adam.
Yeah, so I think that's all that's left is to thank everyone for attending and especially thank Matt, Richard, Juliet, James, David, Lee and Anna for sort of all of their input today to make it a really interesting session. And also to those working behind the scenes to host the event, so Caroline and her team at the back. And we will be publishing a note of the event, so we will circulate that around. And if you have met anyone and you didn't get a business card or can't remember their name, please just let us know, and we're very happy to introduce or reintroduce you to that person. So yeah, thank you for coming and have a good day.